Okay, everybody, we're going to start up again. So grab a drink and take your seats. Okay, so my plan for the next hour or so is to go through each of the topics and just briefly give my opinion about the best practices off the top of my head. I didn't write them down, so I'll probably miss things, but starting with ones that I think are easier than others. So the order will be different, and some of the topics that some of you might be most interested in may be right at the end, but I thought it'd be easier for me to take the easy ones first. So first of all, I want to start off with CPUE, standardization. And so what I think is the best practices is once you've created your spatial structure, if you find a stock that's fairly well defined in terms of not much movement in and out that would affect the population, then you would create a spatial temporal model of some kind to analyze that CPUE data and then do weighting by CPUE and space to get your overall index of the whole population. If you have multiple subpopulations in there, you would do the same thing, but break out the indices by population. If you'd probably do each individual population separately too, just to make sure the correlation structure didn't change among those subpopulations, which would require you to do separate analyses for each subpopulation, or possibly have a total integrated, a model of the total, the whole combined stock, but one that allows for spatial variation in the correlation structure, which I don't know if we have now anyway, so that wouldn't be the current good practice. And to do the same thing with the link frequency data, so that you can make the link frequency represent the population by spatially weighting it by CPUE, and then including that in the model as an index that has its own selectivity and own composition data separate from the fisheries. There are some aspects of tuna populations that would be interesting to look at, like combining the different fleets. And I think that's something that we should be looking at for longline data. But we want to be careful about the selectivity and see if the selectivity and catchability would be consistent among those fleets. So does anyone else have anything to add to that, or want to modify any of those suggestions or add other suggestions? Yeah, Carolina.
I was thinking that it will be important to define the spatial domain of the index, and especially if we think about our conceptual model, what will be the habitat this stock will be, because we are going to have to sum up these areas, right? And because the fishery might not be going to the area with low density, there might be something that will affect the index. At least do some sensitivity there. That's something I noted for my own consumption, let's say.
Yeah, so filling in spatial strata, particularly ones that are not missing at random, but missing because they're on the edge of the population, and if it's quite a large piece, particularly if it's had effort in the past but not present, or the other way around. We still haven't developed methods to actually solve that problem. I think Nicola and his group are looking at some of that, which might require covariates and things like that. And also you're also looking at preferential sampling. So there needs to be some research into that component of using CPUE indices, yeah. Yeah, Dan?
Sorry, just a minor point, maybe related. We're not just, Tuna assessment, we're not just talking about long line data, right? Maybe in IATTC, but some, at least IATTC is just, long line is just a very, these days just a very small component of it, 5% of total catches. So we're dealing with probably more fisheries and more issues. But of course, you can do the best you can. Maybe, you know, if long line data you can process with spatial temporal model, you do that. But with other fishery, you can't. But that just cause some kind of inconsistency, isn't it? You preferably you want to process your data in a similar way. So I just think maybe we need to have some guideline for how you deal with data that doesn't have, you know, you probably can't do the spatial temporal model. And of course, I understand spatial temporal model these days become kind of common or good practice. But in some way, I think a lot of simulation was showing that it gives similar results as GLM, right? So to what extent we can, you know, also use GLM for this kind of standardizations as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I guess one broad question to ask in the Tuna context is, should we be using per scene data for CPUE? And I'm not talking about the echo sounder buoy stuff, but actually catch per day fished, catch per set, catch per something else for per scene as an index of abundance. Yeah, Paul?
Yeah, it's a good question. I was thinking this as well when Dan brought up, it's not all about long line. I mean, lots of our CPUE data come from per scene, and sometimes we find it really hard to use. And I guess this hyperstability issue that we tend to be worried about with these data is a concern that we've had, and why we've shied away from, you know, using per scene where we can, but we've focused in Skipjack on another index, pole and line, which is also subject to hyperstability. They're all school targeted fisheries. So we have a big issue with indices for skipjack tuna fisheries in particular, that I don't know what the answer is for it. We can run models where we can try to put scenarios of, you know, removing some sort of hyperstability effect and look at the sensitivity of the reference points and things like that, but that's not ideal either. We actually do need an abundance index here, and I don't think for skipjack close kin's going to be potentially a feasible approach for skipjack either. So we tend to rely probably a fair bit in these models on the tag data, which as we know is not a perfect design either because of the difficulties in tagging fish. So real concerns around skipjack, but I guess one thing that we've started to do now that we have VMS data and travel distance, we've started looking at different effort metrics that may be more representative of the, you know, the actual effort required to catch fish. And Tom, I don't know if you wanted to mention what you've been doing. I think that's starting to show promise.
Yeah, so just from the work that I've been doing with CPUE standardization, I feel like, and me and Paul have talked a lot about this, that really the key to being able to really use it as an indication of relative abundance, we need to think about how we're defining effort. And, you know, what you were just hinting about, you know, Mark, about, you know, catch per set or catch per day. You know, you're not gonna bring in any fish on a school unless you see it right there in front of you. So that's not really telling you anything in terms of effort. We've looked at the VMS data. Has been really good because, you know, they're getting a location every half hour, and so from one set to the next, you know, you may have traveled quite some distance to find that school. And so if you can use, you know, we've used VMS data to define travel path as and use that as our effort metric, which is, I think, been really promising in terms of redefining effort, which so these kind of just trying to be resourceful of what we have available to us, and I think that VMS data can be a great resource that we should tap into as well. So, but just some thoughts on that.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, the main reason we don't like it in the EPO is because there's a high proportion of fad fishing, even in the vessels that do a lot of free swimming school sets, and so it makes it more difficult. But perhaps in other oceans, there's less combination of fad and school sets.
I can make one comment for that is regarding that. We did only a free school only index, and that way you remove the fad as being an issue, because I mean, with the fads, I mean, they're basically, a lot of those fishermen are they're just bouncing from one fad to another. They just following sort of looking for a density of fads, and so they're not really searching in the kind of true way of searching. So that's why we opted for a free school only index.
But is it vessels that only fish on free schools, or is it vessels that fish on both and you eliminate the fads somehow?
So that was something we also had to think about as well. And so we kind of came up with a way of classifying what we considered as a free school only kind of fishers. So and just looking at, you may have been, because during the closure, you have people who are, what do they do during the closure? They go and they do free school fishing, but they're not very good at it. So they're not really giving us a sense of abundance. And so we sort of found a way to sort of classify, remove anybody that wouldn't be considered kind of your free school only experts, and I think that was useful as well. That was very promising.
Okay, thanks. Any other comments about CPUE? No? Nothing online. Okay. Recruitment. So we came up with, so Andre gave his presentation on recruitment. He mentioned the best practices were, I think, like estimate the stock recruitment relationship, have a state space model and all that sort of thing. But we don't do it that way. So the feasible or the practical good practices would be fixing steepness, the standard deviation, maybe even the autocorrelation inside the model. But we have to come up with priors for that. So to do the good practices for recruitment, would have to somehow do some research on setting up those priors. So that would be sort of the first thing. The second thing would be to make sure you apply the bias correction properly, so that you're not using the wrong R0 for projections, reference points, things like that. My preference would actually be to choose the years over which you want to assume the average recruitment for your reference points is defined over, and use that. If you have a steepness of 1, it's pretty easy. If you have a steepness other than 1, it's a little tricky. That's pretty much it for single area models. For multi-area models, it gets a bit more tricky. And my preference for that would be actually independent estimates of recruitment for each area by quarter. But sometimes you'll get areas that have, sometimes your model doesn't do that, like stock synthesis doesn't do that. You have to approximate it somehow. And some areas may not have a lot of link frequency data, so they won't have good information on recruitment, which makes it difficult. But I still think that's how you should do it. So I know SPC has a different approach, trying to minimize it using some kind of spliny thing. And Dan, you had a comment?
No, just one, if you can make a clarification, when you say you prefer to estimate independently, what do you mean? You mean separate stock recruitment relationship in each area?
Yeah, I like steepness equals 1, so that's kind of easy for me. But yeah, I would say a separate stock recruitment relationship for each area.
But then you're treating them a different stock. That kind of change your.
Well, you have to, I guess, determine where you think the dispersal is occurring, right? Is dispersal occurring at eggs, larvae, and very small juveniles, or is it just the juveniles and the adults are moving between stocks, right?
Yeah, but all I'm saying is if you're treating them a different stock, that kind of, I saw the first thing you do is for assessment, you build your conceptual model. You have to determine whether it's multi-stock and single stock, right? If it's multi-stock, then you using different stock relationship for different areas, that's fine. But if it's a single stock, I don't think conceptually you use different stock recruitment relationship for different areas. At least conceptually, it's not the right thing to do, right? I guess that depending on how you set up your stock structure, that's what I mean.
Yeah, and again, my intuition on this is that you're never going to be able to estimate the stock recruitment relationship among, for each stock independently, or determine whether it's, each stock has a separate one or there's one for the whole stock. So yeah, you're never going to know that, I don't think, at least in my lifetime. So I think treating them independently is probably the easiest way to go. And I'd also recommend having steepness of 1, but that's probably not going to be the good practice that everyone agrees on. So any other comments on the stock recruitment relationship? Yeah, Carolina?
Yeah, Andre also said for us to decide what steepness value we should agree to always put in the ensemble or something.
Yeah, so I meant that was the first thing I mentioned, is coming up with priors and that on the 3 parameters. So steepness, variability, and autocorrelation. Yeah, Nicola?
Yeah, just a comment on developing those priors for things that we don't think we know that we have any information on to develop them. In Cole's think tank that he did back in January, he actually, if I'm remembering correctly, he talked about how you can actually develop somewhat informative priors for things that you don't really know by kind of pushing through alternative priors and seeing what comes out on the other side. I'm probably mangling that in some way, but I remember something along those lines, so there could be something there.
Yeah, to me that just kind of sounds wrong. It basically, what you're doing is you're filtering your priors through the stock assessment model to see which of them gives you something that's plausible, and presumably the data, with any luck, would eliminate those implausible ones anyway. Right.
Okay, so you're not running any estimation.
Yeah, no, but you would be eliminating implausible ones,
But you're also
yeah.
You're also not necessarily doing it for the entire assessment. You can just do it kind of in a modular component. So just looking at recruitment or whatever. I mean, it's because there is some of that parameter space that really might not be reasonable. So it's kind of trimming off the tails as much as you can.
Yeah, it seems to me just a way to make it more efficient. Right, you get rid of things that aren't plausible, so you don't include those in your full analysis. So you're actually reducing the parameter space that you're going to search over. So you may actually improve the efficiency of the model. Yeah, I don't know. Anyway, something that we should look into to see if it's actually going to help us in the assessments. Any other comments? Yeah, Haikun.
It's a question like, what's your opinion on whether we should assume recurrent deviates sum to 0? I know for R0 likelihood profile, it makes sense to set the sum to 0, but in real assessment, sometimes the result can make a difference when we assume the sum to 0 or not. So what is your opinion on that?
Yeah, my personal opinion is you shouldn't do it because it messes up your distributional assumption. And I'm not quite sure why we do it, but it might be to ensure that when we take the R0 out of the model, it's the right one. But again, if you go back to the approach of either using dynamic reference points or use the average recruitment over a certain period to represent the current regime, you get rid of that. So that's kind of my opinion, but lots of people use it and it seems to make the performance better. So it actually might be a reason to use it is for performance improvements in terms of convergence and things like that. I don't know.
So one question for the SPC team, does multi-fan CR assume recruitment deviate sum to 0?
Yes. And they have there's a separate summation if you're doing a spatial model that it sums to, well, the allocation sums to 1 across regions within a quarter, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, Dan?
Sorry, my understanding is kind of different packages does quite differently, right? Whether it's a hard constraint of summing up to 1 or it's a, soft constraint through penalty, right? SS3 is through a penalty and on top of that, you have this bias correction. That's kind of place constraint, but it doesn't necessarily, once you examine your recruitment DV afterwards, you never get exactly to 1, you never average to 1, maybe get close after your places penalties and bias corrections. I think multi-fan does something similar. It's not a hard constraint, but I know Castle it's a hard constraint. You're basically taking this Francis parameterization to force it to average 1. My understanding is that it's not a problem. It's maybe it's a good practice in the MPD run, but in the MCMC can cause some problems.
Okay.
Mark, can I say something?
Yes, John.
Yeah, just on that particular issue, I'm pretty sure multi-fan CL does not force the annual recruitment deviates to sum to 1. There's various constraints, though, on some of the spatial deviates, as Nicola said. And what we found when we started doing likelihood profiles on R0 was, without that constraint, is that when you start to, put more pressure on the likelihood with, more extreme values of R0, the model's response to that is often just to make the deviates either more negative or more positive, depending on which direction you're going. And that didn't seem to be a very satisfactory type of way of generating the profile, at least to me. And it was for that reason we switched from doing our routine profiles, from doing it on R0 to doing it on the average total biomass, for example, which we could do using a penalty approach rather than just, fixing things. So that was that. On the earlier issue, Mark, talking about specifying sigma R, we had a bit of a discussion about this in the session, and Andre chipped in when I raised the question about whether it should be, set to some value based on, I think he was suggesting a meta-analysis, but I can't really imagine where you would get such a meta-analysis from, because, all Tuna assessments tend to just fix it. The suggestion was that you make it the penalty as small as possible, so R0, the sigma R as large as possible, while still being able to do a reasonable estimation of R0. So I don't think we reached any particular consensus on that, but I remember Andre's comments, and I think it was in response to Carolina's observation that you had the penalties on the stock recruitment relationship sometimes dominating likelihood profiles and really driving, you know, the scaling of R0 in some of those assessments where sigma R is set at a moderately low value like 0.6. So it might be good to get some kind of finalization on that particular point. My response to Andre said that, you know, if you set R0 at a very high level, such as 2, which is what we tend to do, that can make your projections go all haywire. But of course, well, we don't use the sigma R in any way in terms of sampling of future recruitments. When we do projections, we use the actual estimated sample from the actual estimated recruitment due. So yeah, be good to get some recommendations on that.
Yeah, so it really depends on what your assumption is for that sigma R. Like in stock synthesis, the way we typically assume is that that's sigma R is actually a good representation of the distribution of the recruitment deviates. Whereas one way of doing it is just so that if you do have a recruitment where there's very little information, it goes to 0, which would be, you know, putting a penalty of like a CV of 2 on it, right? But then you have to work out what you're going to do for reference points and projections. And so rather than using the R0 and the standard deviation you used in the model, you'd have to somehow look at the recruitments over a period where you think they're reliably estimated and representing the current status, and you would use those for reference points and projections. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I think that makes sense, and is pretty much what we do.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on to the next topic, is natural mortality. And so for natural mortality, another pretty uncertain parameter, but it looks as though looking at using Chi's relationship with length to get the natural mortality for the young individuals as the natural mortality reduces as they get older, and then using some relationship with maximum age for the overall natural mortality. The question would be, do you use the maximum age from your population or from some other population that's had more samples? And presumably you'd want to do it from the one that has a lot more samples, because we've got fairly low sample size for aging in a lot of oceans. There are some issues with maximum age, but it seems like it's the best that's available. We don't really have much other choice until we sort out our tagging programs. There might be the potential of getting estimates of natural mortality at size from the tagging studies if we do the spatial temporal fine scale modeling of the tagging data to deal with the mixing period. But we have to be careful there about the selectivity curve and overestimating natural mortality for older fish, because of most of the tag data is coming from the purse seine fisheries, which has a very dome-shaped selectivity. I don't think we should be using a different natural mortality between males and females until we do a bit more modeling, looking at the differences in growth and seeing whether or not the sex ratios for older individuals can be explained by the differences in growth that we're seeing now. There's a possibility that the males and females will have both different growth and different natural mortality. And that's sort of explained by the biological relationships between M and K. We see that in things like flatfish, where there's quite a big difference in growth for males and females, and we also see differences in natural mortality for those. But for tunas, the growth rates don't differ as much. So it's unclear at this stage how that's going to come out, but it definitely needs some reevaluation using the different growth rates and fitting to the sex-specific composition data. Any comments on that? We've got one thumbs up. Dan?
I think it makes sense to use, of course, all the discussions make sense to use age-specific natural mortality. Just wonder whether, as people have experience of, does it actually make a difference? It seems to me it's really the scales that matters. And I tried a number of occasions, just use constant natural mortality, and as long as the average matches the functional one, it doesn't really matter in terms of assessment result. I understand it's kind of have implications for fish mortality for fishery catch small fish, but yeah, and also how many assessment apart from tuna assessment was actually using age-specific natural mortality. I understand a lot of New Zealand assessment they don't assessment New Zealand and commercial fishery they don't use age-specific natural mortality. So
yeah, so I guess one issue we have is that we're catching juveniles. So the mortality of small fish actually might matter. The experience I've had is that the steepness of the for young fish doesn't matter so much, at least in what we're using. It's that it's the point where it goes to. So it's the medium-sized fish, not the very small ones, that it matters, right? It can have an impact, and with Kai's relationship, because it's a constant slope and it's fixed at the older fish, right? When you move the older fish, it moves everything. So we don't see that sensitivity. We think it's related. It's just the overall scaling, right? But in our current versions, it depends on where we put that breakpoint. So it's not how high the youngest ones are. It's really if you push that breakpoint to older fish that you start getting some influences. Yeah, John.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. I think, where it can make a difference, as you say, is when you have fisheries targeting juveniles and fisheries targeting adults, and in the management is often interested in apportioning the fishery impact to particular fisheries, so they can sort of point the finger. And that's where it would make quite a bit of difference, I think, having much higher natural mortality for juveniles will tend to reduce the fishery impact for that component, for fisheries targeting that component of the stock. In terms of using the life history methods to come up with a estimate of the asymptotic M, I suppose you could call it. My first choice would be to see if you can estimate that, particularly if you have tagging data in the model. And I think at least for several of our assessments, that's probably where we would start. And if we can't get reasonable estimates, then to go back to the life history AMAX type stuff to specify.
Yeah, thanks, John. Any comments on M? Okay, done. So now we're going to growth. There's lots of different aspects of growth. I'm going to ignore whether or not you can estimate growth from annual rings, because we're stock assessment people, not biologists, so we'll leave that till later. So basically, how should we estimate growth? My opinion is that we should integrate the data into the model, because we want to take into consideration selectivity and length-based sampling. So you would include the data is aged conditioned on length, and just ignore any age effects, because they're probably less likely than the length effects. Then we have to change our code so that we can integrate the length the growth increment data from tagging data into the model. Estimating the variational length at age is going to be difficult. because there's lots of different components that go into that. One of the differences is the growth increment data is recorded in exact number of days of the increments, whereas the age length data, conditional age on length data is in bins. So it would imply a different variability because it has additional variability because of the how much something grows within a quarter and the birthday within a quarter. And then I think that's about it. But I think we should estimate those growth parameters in the model, estimate the variation of length of age in the model as a function of CV, as a function of length, not of age. And if we have problems with L infinity, I'm not quite sure on that one yet. So Simon, you have a comment.
In general, I kind of agree that it's good to try to estimate growth inside the model. One caution though is that you can get a lot of conflict between different data sets, and then you get a compromise which is the wrong answer. Like we tried that with in the WCPO Big I assessment. It was estimating growth inside the model, but then when you look at the fits to the cohorts, it was getting different fits in different regions. And when we estimated one region at a time, we got different growth curves from the fits within each region. And when we put all of the data in the model, it tended to fit to the northern region, data from region 1, because that had the strongest cohorts, because it was seasonal and it had the, so it would hang on to that trend. This was without any otolith data, agent length data. So yeah, I think there's a lot of information that you can get from fitting it inside the model, but you need to be aware of issues like that, and it also points the way to getting kind of different kinds of information, like new information, by fitting inside the model.
Yeah. Okay, so let's modify that best practice, and this would be related to every component of the model, is that if you have a data set that you can use to estimate a particular parameter, like a growth or something like that, you should always analyze the data externally to the model as well to investigate different aspects of that particular data set, and then use that to help you inform when you're doing it inside the model. I still think you should do it inside the model most of the time, but you should also analyze the data outside the model just in case. And same with natural mortality and things like that. You know, if you estimate natural mortality inside the model, you want to compare that to the maximum age estimate, maybe other biological parameter estimates like K, function of K and things like that, just to give you a little more insight into it and perhaps identify misspecification. Yeah. Carolina, yeah?
So you said that we shouldn't do the M by sex, right? We will have to have the growth by separate by sex, right? Sex specific growth to be able to explain the
yes,
sex frequencies.
Yes, so I think that we should be having sex specific growth as well. Good point, yeah. But
then we will need those sex ratios to be able to estimate, right? Inside the model. Inside the model, or well, sex-specific growth data, whatever.
Yeah, so we would have sex-specific information. So in the model, you would put in the conditional age at length by sex to try and estimate sex-specific growth, yes. And that also relates to what we're going to talk about next, selectivity. There might be something there. You wouldn't need the sex-specific composition data, like the length composition data in the model, for growth, but for selectivity, you would. Okay. Anything else on natural mortality? Okay, done. This is like going in Congress, you know, it's passed. Or one of the commissions, I guess, the resolution. So the next one's selectivity. So we should, first of all, you have to define your fisheries. Let's assume we're doing it for one particular stock or a substock. We want to, each fishery should be modeled separately. So each, oh, sorry, well, that's kind of circular there. Each gear type should be modeled separately. So obviously purse seine on floating object, unassociated, and dolphins should all be different. Longline should be different. Bait boat should be different. All the set nets and things like that should be different. It gets a little complicated in the non-EPO areas where you've got all these little fisheries, which might, because of the small amount of catch, you can probably model those in a certain way. Some of them might have a lot of catch, but if they have a lot of catch, you should be modeling them as separate fisheries. And once you've done that, then you need to apply one of these regression tree, like a clustering approach, to cluster the link frequency, to define, to determine if there's any structure in there that you should be separating it out as fisheries. We need to develop more flexible clustering methods to have irregular, contiguous areas for that. We also need to adjust for the recruitment strength, but we need to have in the model season, space, year maybe, if we've already adjusted for the year effect. I'm not sure how that works, but it might be. See if there's temporal changes in selectivity. And then possibly other covariates should be able to be included in there, such as environment covariates, if we're going to develop spatially time-varying fisheries. So once we've got that, we want to look at the length frequency distributions, and I think if they all look fairly double normal, I think that's means that we've done what we can. If they don't look double normal, we have to look further into how we can split them up, particularly the Indian Ocean free swimming school ones. And if you can't work it out, then splitting it down the middle might be the only way to go, which is what the Indian Ocean does. Then put those in the model and estimate double normal distribution, selectivity curves for them, possibly time varying parameters or blocks on those. I haven't worked that one out yet. And then once you've run your model, do an empirical selectivity diagnostics and see whether or not those fits are reasonable. And if there's some weird looking selectivity curves or misfits, I guess, then you have to re-evaluate that fishery to see if you can split it up into multiple fisheries or make it time varying. And of course have different selectivities for the index and the fishery. So any comments on that suggestion? Yeah, Simon.
I guess about the regression tree option, I think it's a good idea, but not the first step, because it's a bit of a black box when it just pops out with these options for fisheries. Before you do that, you should plot the distribution of the size data so you can understand what you're seeing, and then you can truth it against what the regression tree shows you. As well as regression trees, I guess you want to do like boosted regression trees or random forest or something too, because a single regression tree has a certain amount of randomness in what it throws out. So it's better to use the averaging methods.
Yeah, so I actually don't know what method ours uses, but I think we need a more sophisticated classification method anyway, and I don't know whether it would be a regression tree or some other approach. As far as looking at them, looking at the link frequency distributions, Haikun's package actually does that for you. And so you can actually look at it. So once it's done the split, you can actually see the different distributions, and it also spatially maps the distributions. So we typically always look at that, but yeah, that's true. We should be looking at those to see that they make sense. Dan, yeah.
So one issue with using the regression tree I can see is that every time you do a new assessment with new data, that means your definition of fishery for the same gear can be completely different. Maybe that's a good thing to do, but in terms of, you know, transparency and explaining to stakeholder, that kind of thing, it just makes, there seems to be a, you know, I can see there's some issues there, I guess. All right.
Yeah, Haikun?
Yeah, so it is a good point. So one recommendation I have regarding using the regression tree is that you shouldn't use the regression tree on a single time period. You need to do some sensitivity, like for example, using the whole period or using only the period with very good data. So by doing some sensitive analysis in advance, you have idea how your result is to different periods of data. Yeah.
Yeah. And one of the things that you have to do with the regression trees is you got to determine how many fisheries you want, right? We just arbitrarily chose 4 fisheries because it was a compromise between too few and too many, but very subjective. But my criteria would be you do it until the average link frequency distribution for that particular fishery looked double normal. So if it doesn't look double normal, keep going. If it looks double normal for all of them, you can probably stop. At least as a sort of a broad overarching sort of way of determining the number of fisheries. Okay. Any other comments on selectivity? No, done. Okay, let's go. Oh, check them. Let's go to model weighting. Okay, so how should we do model weighting? I don't think at this stage we've actually got a very good way to do the model weighting. I don't think hindcasting is the greatest way to weight models because it's really dependent on the data that you're doing the Mars or whatever on. So it might bias which model actually is a good model because it's not actually the management quantity, and I still am not certain about the relationship between CPUE and our management quantities. So until that has further research, the actual fit to the data again is still a problem until we work out our data weighting, which we might actually work out. So that might actually be something in the future we could do. But my guess is the model weighting is going to have a few problems for a while. I don't think diagnostics is the right way to do it. Diagnostics are really to reject models or to tell us how to improve models. And a lot of the research, well, okay, a lot of the arguments that the ecologists had in their paper was that really the model weighting didn't do much, change much. We also found in a lot of the applications that the model weighting didn't change much either. So I think we should be focusing more on what models go into the model averaging or into the ensemble at this stage before we worry too much about model weighting, which is all about diagnostics, and also which models go into the diagnostics. It's pretty easy to reject models that fail the diagnostics, but it's hard to know what models we forgot to include, which is something Simon was telling me about as we went for lunch. So I think that's an important concept, is actually you have to think it's not just model weighting that we have to think about. We have to actually start from the start, is to make sure we get the right models coming into the process, the diagnostics approach to reject and improve models. And then the model weighting is actually just the fine tuning part at the end. Because once you've got good models in there, hopefully they all do pretty well anyway. Otherwise, they would have been rejected because of the diagnostics to start with. So starting with the conceptual model and coming up with a good set of hypotheses about the population and what sort of the general structure of the model should be, then using all the good practices to turn those concepts into real models, and then putting them through the diagnostics and rejecting or fixing them. I think with equal weighting, or probably it doesn't matter which way you weight them at the end, you can use data weighting, or well, maybe not data weighting, but hindcasting or something like that. It's not going to change things much based on what we saw. And then that's pretty much it. So my current good practices would be to focus more about the models that go in and the diagnostics and fixing the models and rejecting models rather than the data weighting. Does anyone have any comments on that? Yeah, Nicola?
I think you pretty much captured it. I guess the one thing that I'm still a little bit concerned about is perhaps the discrimination that the ability to discriminate for some diagnostics. Yeah, I guess I'm just worried that there could be situations. Again, it's probably specific for which diagnostics you're looking at, but they don't all have, I think, that power to, thumbs up, thumbs down. But otherwise, yeah, I think I agree with pretty much everything you said.
Okay, thanks. Just to comment on that, and so we're going to get to diagnostics soon, hopefully too, so we can cover a bit of that in there. Yeah, Simon?
Yeah, I think it's, need to consider as many dimensions of uncertainty as possible, because as people were saying, a lot of the uncertainty comes from structural uncertainty, and we often don't consider a lot of that. So methods that can allow us to consider more dimensions, I think, are worth using.
Yeah, Philip.
Yeah, I also agree with pretty much all you've said, Mark. I think for me at the moment the best practice is in the process, and like you said, essentially setting up a transparent process, and then also, I guess, documenting and illustrating what you've taken into account, and also perhaps the axes that you haven't taken into account. There are practical constraints on what you can do, but I guess sometimes we might have an hypothesis on what the outcome of that might be, or or how important that might be. So I think just laying that out there, sometimes, for example, you might not be able to get or have a spatial model at the granularity that you would like, that you think ought to be important, because either your data doesn't let you, or it's too computationally complex. But I think highlighting, for example, that that's a key uncertainty that is not in your ensemble, I think is also a good practice. So perhaps finding ways to consistently report that, what you think was left out for various reasons and what's in, and then and then essentially you can discuss both. Obviously, you only see what you see, but I think at that point, at least, it's transparent for managers that there's a limitation to the interpretation that is all the stuff that you haven't put in.
Yeah, good idea. Paul, you had a comment?
Yeah, just interested in this idea, and I think it's a really great way to go, because the whole weighting thing has been a real difficult one, and in the past, and we're going to have a communication thing to deal with here now with the science committees, because they've been asking for objective weighting processes and trying to get us to come up with ways, and we've realized how difficult that is. So we go to SC this year with a set of models, and if we follow this process and try to justify why we left ones in and dropped ones out, and basically saying, sorry guys, there's no weighting going on here, there's no arbitrary weighting, there's no options. Yeah, we just need to somehow think of a way we're going to get this through to the various SCs earlier rather than later, that this is the approach that we've decided at this stage, and we need to do more work on weighting, and that we don't think that it should be considered in these forums until that's done.
Yep, good. Okay, I think we've done that topic. That was actually meant to be data weighting. I wrote model weighting twice. So now let's go on to data weighting. So data weighting, yes. Okay, so for indices of abundance, run your age-structured production model and with recruitment devs and estimate the standard deviation, and that's your standard deviation for your index of abundance. Obviously, you'll take the annual CVs from whatever method you're using, which should be a spatial temporal model, of course. The length frequency, composition data. I don't know about age conditional and length, but at least the length frequency ones, you should be estimating your effective sample size outside the model and using that as a pretty good approximation of what it should be, and then comparing the effective sample size with that to make sure that there isn't much of a difference. And if there isn't much of a difference, then you have got rid of most of your model misspecification and modeled enough process variation. You can also look at the Francis method to see as well, but I don't, you might want to compare the, maybe this is right, I don't know. If you compare the Francis method and the multinomial type approach, whatever the Murdoch, McAllister and Iannelli approach, if those are pretty much the same, you've also probably got an indication that you've got rid of most of the model misspecification because there's no correlation in residuals. Could be wrong with that, but I think that might be right. I think that's it. If you have some really bad length frequency data or something that you don't really like, then extra down weighting is fine for those too, as long as it's for a fishery, not for the index. Any comments on that approach? Yeah, Haikun?
Yeah, so one point I raised during the spatial workshop is that I think it's important to check the temporal trend in residual in mean length, because some methods doesn't count for that. There's a very strong temporal trend in the residual. We need to take care of that by adding time varying selectivity or down weighting, but we shouldn't just base only on tuning or self-weighting method. We need to look at the residual.
Yeah, so that would be part of the diagnostic. So any model that had that type of residual pattern would probably be rejected or at least put through the modification system to improve it. So hopefully one would identify that in that process and add the time varying selectivity or whatever was needed. Any other comments? Dan?
I'm not sure if we have covered the issue of if you have multiple indices in the model. I think it's pretty common for tuna assessment, right? I think one way, of course, you can kind of one at a time that kind of approach. But another suggestion that quite often heard is to, sometimes people do is to estimate put additional variance on top of the CV already added. I'm not sure how effective that are, whether people have experience of doing that kind of approach.
Yeah, so what I mentioned was fitting the age-structured production model with recruitment deviates to the index. I'm guessing you probably want to do all indices combined, and you would be using an additive CV for each index that you estimate. I think so, yeah.
Sorry, what do you mean by all indices combined?
Well, if you have multiple indices for the same stock, you would include both of them in your age structure correction model. Yeah. Okay, done. We're doing really well here. Okay, process variation. Okay, so obviously the best way to add process variation is to use a state space model and estimate the standard deviation. We can't do that until we get those models. I mean, yeah, obviously there's a few applications that can, but I don't think any of our Tuna ones do. We could do it if we're using MCMC. So stock synthesis runs MCMC. There's some tricks to estimate the standard deviation because you have to do the MLE first before you can run MCMC. So you might have to trick it into getting a decent value to start with without hopefully messing up the jumping rule. But anyway, so let's ignore that for now. How do we do it in penalized likelihood? I think we're going to have to fix the variant, the CV. So somehow we're going to have to get an external estimate of the CV of the things we want to vary over time. Right, so like recruitment, we've already talked about that. The sigma R for the recruitment devs is coming from some meta-analysis, which someone else is going to find out for us. Now, what processes are we going to have recruitment temporal variation in? And so the obvious ones are recruitment, which we're already doing, selectivity, which we kind of talked about. The question is whether you want to do it on every fishery, which is kind of what I used to support. I'll get to that a bit later. The other option is probably natural mortality. This is in a single stock model. Obviously, if we're doing multi-stocks, there would be movement, and multi-sub-stocks, there would be movement and things like that. But natural mortality. So the question is, do we want to have time varying natural mortality? Nicholas's simulation analysis suggests if you model temporal variation in a process and you're modeling the wrong process, you can get huge biases. So you kind of have to be careful what you do. I don't know if this is the right thing to do, but intuitively, I think this is what we should do is, if you're going to model time varying natural mortality, you better also be modeling time varying selectivity in all your fisheries, at least all the fisheries that have got a lot of weight on the comp data. Otherwise, you might actually end up modeling temporal variation and selectivity with natural mortality. Although if you model time varying selectivity in all fisheries, you might actually adjust for the natural mortality as well. So that might be a bit of a problem. Where would you get the natural mortality CV from? I guess you'd have to do some kind of meta-analysis, but I doubt whether there's much information on that. I don't know, that's about it. I think definitely need some more research on this topic. So we encourage people to continue doing the research on how to do modeling of process variation. Okay, any comments on that or adjustments? Yeah, Fukuda-san.
Yeah, time varying natural mortality sounds like mainly the time varying stock recruitment relationship as well. So it's very complicated, and I have no good idea for that. But yeah, it affects to the other biological process as well. So yeah, I also think we need more research for that.
Yeah. Yeah, Aaron.
Yeah, I just was going to second some further research, especially when we think about variances, estimating variances. I mean, we've got some evidence now in state space we can do that. But when we start thinking about doing that across many different things, recruitment, selectivity, natural mortality, et cetera, I think we're getting into a realm where we're going to see a lot of interesting things happen, possibly not even intuitive. So just seconding that research, especially in that interactive multiple variance estimates at the same time.
Yeah. Okay. Anything else on process variation? I just want to mention that we probably shouldn't even worry about process variation in the stock recruitment relationship because we can't estimate it without variation. There's regime shifts and stuff like that, so it's probably a impossible task, but that's my opinion. Okay, let's move on to the next one, diagnostics. So what diagnostics should we use? It's really difficult at this stage to know what diagnostics are good, what criteria we should use for diagnostics, what results from diagnostics tells us about what has been misspecified. So at this stage, I think we should be applying all the diagnostics and essentially subjectively evaluating them. There are some kind of rules of thumbs that we should be using, although I'm not sure that those are really that useful at this stage. The main thing is we need to do a lot more research. I think it's fairly feasible to actually come up with something. Whether the results will be definitive or not, I don't know, but a huge simulation analysis, extending what Felipe and his group are doing, where we basically take every single peer-reviewed stock synthesis model, chuck it in a big simulator, and then apply a whole lot of misspecifications, including combinations of misspecifications, process variability and parameters. We're not actually modeling process variability, misspecified values of natural mortality, growth parameters, L infinity, all of these things, and then apply that in the simulator with the misspecified model and apply all the diagnostics. And so the misspecifications would be at different levels, and then determine the management quantity. Let's just say it's F divided by FMSY, which is probably the most useful one. And then chuck it in some kind of big data AI thing, and out will come a regression tree that tells us exactly what's wrong with our model given the results of the diagnostics. That's what we have to do, and that's what Felipe and his group are starting on. We just have to make sure that we continue it to get to a place where we can use the diagnostics in a fairly automated way with criteria that are well defined based on these sort of objective type of analysis rather than having to rely on subjective judgment. Any comments on that? Yeah, Phil.
Yeah, I just wonder whether we have to go quite as ambitious as model all the stock synthesis models ever created. Whether an easier path is to essentially try and focus on simulation work for particular models, and I guess for a particular model, with known misspecification, understand which diagnostics can pick those up. I imagine that there will be model differences between species, but depending on information content in your data and a number of those things. So I guess I think, to my mind, there's always limits to the generality of all those simulation studies, and And so perhaps focusing that effort on particular models rather than trying to generalize, when perhaps it's not always possible. I think that, that's, I guess, where I would put my effort.
Yeah, I think that's a good suggestion. Obviously, we won't know until we do it whether that's going to be sufficient or whether we need a lot more models or something like that. To create a general rules, we'd have to do a lot more. But if you had enough time or the software was already developed, so automatically did it for you, I think that would be great. To have focusing the analyses on the specific model often is a lot more powerful than doing it on lots of different models with different assumptions, because the diagnostics may work for some but not others, and therefore you're sort of smudging out the ability of the diagnostic to pick up the problem. So yeah, if the software was developed in a way that we could do that, that would be great too, because you could even use both approaches, right? You could have one where you were fine-tuning it to your population. Yeah, Nicola, you have a comment?
Yeah, I think where Phil was going with this is maybe like using self-tests to do that. And I guess the other thing I would add, maybe not necessarily a diagnostic, but going through and taking bits of data out of the model, either fleet by fleet or different components, and seeing where the model goes I don't know if it's a traditional diagnostic, but it's a really good way of getting a feel for what's pulling the model in different directions.
Yep. Okay, we have one online. I'm guessing it's John Hampton or Matt.
It's Matt. Yeah, I was just going to say, would it make sense to do these sort of simulations using the SPM models, the very spatially refined models, instead of looking at individual variances in that that are occurring in the models, and see if they can pick up model misspecification as well, in terms of maybe space and including variability in natural mortality or catchability or something like that.
Yeah, it's something worth thinking about. I just have a feeling that might be too complicated to start with. I think we might end up with a result that is not useful, or a result that we don't understand. Obviously, I could be wrong, but it's just, I wouldn't want to go down that track and spend a lot of energy on it. To start with, I think the other approach would probably be at least the first step, and then move on from there to more complicated evaluations. Okay, any more comments on that? No? Okay, done. I'm going to go tagging data now. So everyone probably knows what I'm going to say here. Don't include the tagging data in your tuna assessment, at least for the tropical tunas. Model it outside using some spatial temporal model, so that you can deal with tag mixing and make the most of the actual tags, rather than having a mixing period and throwing out most of the data. Until we actually get better tagging programs. About 2 or 3 years ago, I was probably really negative on tagging programs, but now with these fine scale spatial temporal models and that are being used, I'm actually a lot more positive. So that's a sort of improvement in my perception on things. We still have to worry about tag reporting, tag loss. I think that's it, right? Whatever, tagging mortality. So most programs should make sure that they have procedures in place that actually allow us to estimate those. So double tagging, tag recovery officers to make sure all the data is good, all those sort of things that are related to having a good tagging program. Okay, also related to tagging, everyone should be doing close-kin marker capture, but that's sort of a given. Okay, any comments on that? People must be getting tired if that one goes through that quickly. Right, we've got 10 minutes and I've only got a couple more subjects left. Oh, Matt, you have a comment?
I'm just going to say that's not what we said in our presentation at all, so I disagree, but we won't go into that much deeper.
Yeah, noted. Okay, thanks, Matt. Okay, so no other comments. Let's go on to modeling stock structure. Okay, so basically, if you've created your conceptual model and you have not found really good evidence for any stock structure, for example, if it's a bluefin tuna, you pretty much know what's going on. You know, there may be some uncertainty about how many stocks there are on what side and things like that, but you know, the two stock in the Atlantic and the whatever, the movement from the east, from the west to the east in the Pacific for the juveniles. Other than sort of things like that, you should really be using the areas as fleets approach, I think. And you should be doing your CPU analysis of the whole stock and doing the fishery structure stuff and all that sort of stuff we've talked about before. And then when you run your model, you should also create indices of abundance for each areas as fleet for that index, related to that index, and have an index for those as well. And then you should compare those to see if the model is able to estimate those indices using the selectivity that's estimated. If it can, you have some, well, there is support for what you're doing. If they're quite different, then you're going to have to go back and reevaluate your stock structure. I haven't finished yet, but we'll get there. So in some cases, you have to, in your conceptual model, you got to make sure you're pretty thorough, and you got to look at all these things, and we might find that there's a lot more stock structure in the tropical tunas with respect to growth and movement, and it may just be isolation by distance or partly isolation by distance, but we might have multiple stocks that we can model as separate populations and completely independent assessments, and we should basically consider that. Finally, we really need a lot more data to determine the stock structure. So we need, well, first of all, we need to know if larvae, if the spawning of individuals moves from the local area until they get to the fishery. In between the spawning and when a fish enters the fishery, is there much movement of tuna? And then if there isn't, then we can do close-kin analysis to determine stock structure. I could be wrong on that, but that's kind of my current thinking. Okay, Nicola, you had a comment? Yeah. No. Okay. Anyone else? Carolina, yeah.
Part that you said, do an areas as fleet approach, then one index for the whole area, then separate index for each areas as fleet, or?
Yes, separate areas for each of the indices, related fishery, and those would not be fit in the model. They would just be put in the model to see if the model could fit them well, if it needed to. And so basically it's taking the selectivity and using that to determine whether it can, explain that. Right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And also, would you do the fishery definition in a way that if you need, you can move to a spatial model, like, so make them consistent among years?
No, I wouldn't. I would, if you were going to do a spatial model as well, it's like as the sensitivity or something like that, I think then you would start thinking about how to split it up. I wouldn't restrict the areas as Fleet's model because you think there's that kind of spatial structure. I'd let the regression analysis determine the fleets, even if they are different for different fleets, different gear types, sorry. Okay, any comments? What about different, well, okay, well, I'm giving my good practices, I should say what I think first. So I also think we should do some research into developing methods that can deal with different link frequencies in different areas, which is somehow related to spatial age length keys and whether or not that turning those and whether or not we can actually reliably calculate those, which we probably can't in tunas, but maybe other species we can, and apply that to get spatial age data, which we can sum up and use to avoid the problems with different growth rates among areas. And then also investigate whether or not we can do that inside the model somehow, as we were talking about earlier on. But I think that's all sort of a research topic, and it might be related to some of the simulation analysis that people are doing. The current simulations don't have different growth rates among areas, but I think that should be a consideration where we can do that. And we also might want to think about the size structured models in this context. So that's where the size structured modeling comes in. But a lot of that is all research, so that would be recommended research and maybe funding priorities on that type of research. But I'm sure there's a lot of other research that has priorities that we haven't talked about either. Okay, any comments on that? Okay, good.
Mark, just one quick comment.
Yeah, Aaron.
I'm just thinking about, you know, the data and we need more data and how that relates to research. And I just wanted to mention that I think it's best practice for us to show via simulation what we can expect with more data. I mean, with limited funds, that it's a natural thing that has to happen. So that's best practice. And I think oftentimes we look for more funding, but really the burden is on us as scientists to prove that. So just a comment.
Okay, so we're nearly done for the day, and so we've got 3 more topics: size data, weight length, and stock structure. I'm not going to cover those. We just need more data and more work. So done with that. That was quick. And no comments, so we've done that too. Okay, well, so we're gonna end. So first of all, so Simon and I are going to put together a report from the workshop. Our current plan, which will probably be the final plan, is to basically go through all the recordings and listen to the talks again and stuff like that, and put together a list of good practices. So the report will be, so the report from the CAPAM meetings is always the chair's report, which basically means I can do whatever I want, and it just makes it easier. And so it'll be the chairs or the co-chairs or whatever we call ourselves, so initial recommended good practices as a sort of a point for discussion. We'll probably distribute it to the keynote speakers and commenters for some comments on that. We don't really want to distribute it wider than that because it'll just be, you know, endless task probably. So if anyone has any particular points that they want to make about good practices, particularly what we talked about this afternoon, or if they go back through and listen to the recording or something like that and have some points that they want us to take into consideration, feel free to email myself. I think that's about it. We don't know how long it will take. We're both really busy, so we'll try and do it as quick as we can, but we can't promise anything. I'd like to thank Simon first for all the hard work. also all the people that worked with him, the AV, the support people at the building here. It's been great. I mean, it's the second one we've had here, and they've both been really successful, and we like to thank them for that support to make it successful. All the speakers, we had a really good group of speakers here, both in person and online. Everyone that came and participated, I think you've greatly improved the discussions, and I think we're making some progress. So I think there's a lot of things for everyone to absorb and go back and fix their assessments. It's probably going to take us a long time, but hopefully we'll make some progress. So thanks again, everyone, and thanks for the sponsors. And I think Simon's probably going to do some thanks as well.
Yep. Thanks again, everyone, for coming and making this a success. Long way to come. Also, of course, thanks, Mark, for doing a great job of chairing, as usual. The bar for tonight is the Waitoa Victoria in Victoria Street, 175 Victoria Street. And one final point, one person who attended here was feeling sick today, did the right thing and didn't come in. They tested positive to COVID. So just be a bit careful and have a test if you're not feeling well. So yeah, sorry to end on that, but yeah, thanks for coming, and see you another time.
That's right, better on the last day than the first day, right?